Alright, so today we're looking at basics of government, beginning of the two-party system. We call that bipartisanship, and that's a key word they're going to love to use, so we need to make sure we know it. First off, the major thing of our country is the Constitution. It's what we believe in. It's what all of our rights are basically in. Now, why do we feel so strongly to do this? We came from England, and England had a king, and the king was elected not by the people, but more or less how much power and royal families and going back into world history. But we have the Constitution. We believe in democracy, and it's also something called capitalism, and we'll get all those terms later on. Now, what makes our government unique is we have three branches of government. We have the legislative branch. They make the laws. That would be our Congress. We do have a bicameral, meaning two houses within our Congress, and that would be the House of Representatives and the Senators. Now, how do you tell them apart? Senators, there's only two from each state, whereas House of Representatives, as it says, is representative upon how much population. So in Mississippi, we have less representatives than somebody, say, California or Texas. The next branch of government is called the executive branch. That is mainly the president and all of his secretaries, which make up what is called his cabinet, as well as advisors and things like that. And so they are based out of the White House. All right. And lastly, there's the judicial branch. The judicial branch is there to make sure that any laws that the legislative and the executive pass down are going by, again, that Constitution we talked about. So those are our three branches of government. Now, the way that this thing works, and to prevent it from ever becoming a dictatorship or something crazy, is something called checks and balances. Now, when people say, I'm going to check you, that's generally trying to point out a flaw or something else like that, and that is not a good way to remember this. The good way to remember this is to check on something. You put a pizza in the oven, you want to check on it and make sure it's cooking thoroughly and that it's done all the way, okay? Checks and balances basically means that the executive branch has only certain things they can do, and they check the judicial and the legislative to make sure they're doing what they're doing. And then also the legislative and judicial will check on the executive to make sure that they are doing what they are doing correctly. Now, if it doesn't work like that, there's other things that happen as well. Now, one of the biggest things, and from Schoolhouse Rock you can see it there, is I'm just a bill upon Capitol Hill. How does a bill become a law? A bill is an idea suggested for a law. It can come from congressmen, but it also can come through something called an initiative, which means it's by the people. And they can sit there and go, hey, I think this would be a great idea for a law. Well, it would go to Congress, and Congress would essentially decide to vote on it. When they do that, that's called a referendum. Now, this process of voting on a law can take a couple of days. It can take 200 years in the case of the 27th Amendment. But eventually, once they vote on it, and it generally happens in the House of Representatives, and then it will go over to the Senate and go through all these things. A lot of bills die on the floor is what it's called, meaning they never get voted on. They just kind of sit there and they erode away. Now, a president, if he doesn't like a law, can actually issue a formal disapproval, and that is called a veto. However, Congress may override a veto with 2/3 vote, and that's happened a few times. And again, that goes back to checks and balances. Maybe the president's doing this because he gives him power or something like that. Now, there are two types of powers in our Constitution. The first is called enumerated, and the second is called implied. Now, enumerated is what you see up there at the top. If it's not in the Constitution, Congress can't do it. Enumerated means written down exactly there as it is, right? Now, an implied power means you potentially have the opportunity to do this. Again, this goes back to some people might explicitly tell you something bad, like they're just going to explicitly lyrics and say it out there. Other people just might imply it, and meaning you have to kind of, as the saying goes, read between the lines. So enumerated powers are written down, and implied are understood powers. Both of them exist within the Constitution, and both of them are there. Now, another thing in the Constitution is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. This said that Congress can make any and all laws that they deem necessary and proper. So what does that mean? Necessary means we need this law. It's not just an idea for more taxes or things like that. And proper meaning it ties back to the Constitution. So as long as they abide by those two rules, they should be fine. Now, another thing that makes our country great is something called habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is Latin. It roughly translates to living body. But habeas corpus is the whole idea to prevent the detention of prisoners. It basically means that if you're ever accused of a crime, you go through this living body thing. You have to go to a court. They have to try you, things like that. And it's all part of something bigger called due process, which I'll talk about in the next video. But habeas corpus basically means a cop can't come up to you and go, oh, I don't like your face, and throw you in jail or kill you potentially. There has to be some type of trial and things like that. Now, the last little part of this, we're going to look at a couple of court cases and see how we're going there. So the first is Marbury versus Madison. Now, this is a highly important court case, and the biggest reason is the Supreme Court didn't have any powers without this. This established what is called judicial review. Without this, the Supreme Court would never be able to decide if a law was constitutional or not. They would just simply have to go by it. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're okay. So, judicial review, Marbury versus Madison. The next one is McCulloch versus Maryland. And I mentioned the necessary and proper clause, and this again came up to necessary and proper. It was about building banks and things like that, and they basically said, hey, as long as they're doing this for the correct reasons, they can. So that will go back and strengthen necessary and proper clauses, meaning Congress can make any laws that they want, so long as they are, again, necessary and proper going by the Constitution. The last court case we have here is Gibbons versus Ogden, and you can kind of see my I am your father thing. This is the idea that if federal and state come in conflict, who has more power, who has the ultimate authority? I like to remember that with federal thinking of father and state thinking of son. If there's a conflict within the home, who would have the last say? And generally, in following good manners and not kind of things that have happened in the past, the father has the last say. Meaning, if federal and state have an issue over something, the federal wins out. And we'll see that a bunch of times throughout history. That's a recurring theme, especially in civil rights. The states decided, well, we don't want to do integration, and the federal government had to get involved numerous times. So Gibbons versus Ogden is what I call the who's your daddy court case. So that's why the who's your daddy, I am your father. Now, an introduction to the bipartisan system we have. The oldest, not necessarily the oldest, they call themselves the GOP. And as you can see, Republican, Conservative, GOP. GOP actually stands for Grand Old Party. And they're not the oldest, but there you go. Conservatives tend to be Republicans nowadays. Before that, they were other parties, Democratic, Republicans, etc. And Republicans go by something called laissez-faire, which means hands off of the government. They believe in helping big business through an economic system that is called supply side. It's also called trickle down, meaning you start at the top and hopefully it'll trickle down to the bottom. And they believe in high tariffs. They want to protect big businesses from competition, things like that. They also believe in lower taxes, again, trying to give tax breaks to the wealthy so that in the hope they'll create more jobs. But that is a kind of a short version of conservative. There are some more things we'll fill out in class on that page you have, so don't worry. Now, liberals generally started around the Progressive era when they wanted to try to fix all the ills that had existed. Liberals tend to be Democrats. They believe in something called Keynesian economics, which we'll get to later on, as well as deficit spending. And they believe in helping a term that people misunderstand, and it is welfare. Welfare, in this sense, is not an EBT card or money to go and get things, but welfare is the benefit of the common people. So they kind of flip the script. They flip things upside down. They're exactly opposite from what we talked about. They believe in helping the downtrodden members of society first, as well as they believe in higher and lower tariffs, because they want competition. They want people to be able to afford things. And then also they believe in high taxes. Point being, they feel that all these people should have programs to help themselves out, and that has to be paid from somewhere. Now, as I said in class, we'll get more about these, so don't worry, but that was the end for that one.